May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Not long ago, a colleague of mine from a neighboring Episcopal church, who happened to be away on vacation, asked me to fill in for him and officiate at the funeral for the grandfather of one of his parishioners. His call caught me at a really bad time. I had been working way too much, and glancing at my calendar, the days ahead did not look any better. So I hemmed and hawed, stalling as I reviewed my to-do list in my head, until he finally begged, "Please, I've already tried 4 others. No one is available." I begrudgingly said yes. So just a few days later, and with not such a generous heart, I arrived at the funeral home to meet this family for the first time. The family, of course, was in mourning, which hit me like a ton of bricks because, as I said, I was not in the best headspace and wasn't prepared to enter into their grief. It wasn't long until everyone had arrived and the family and friends all began taking their seats at the funeral home, and I introduced myself and began the service with a few prayers from our Book of Common Prayer. Then came time for the family to offer their reflections and their memories. And uncharacteristically for me, within seconds, I was moved to tears. Their stories had me laughing and crying out loud. And I sat there not really wanting this service to end and wishing that this family did not have to say goodbye to their beloved and clearly larger-than-life grandfather. But it did, and so next we proceeded silently and reverently to our cars to drive in a long procession following the hearse through the local streets for the cemetery for his burial. Again, I was moved by what I witnessed along the way. First, we drove past an elderly man, walking and holding a child's hand. It must have been his grandson, I thought. And as soon as our procession passed them by, I noticed that he stopped walking and he tugged at the child's arm. And they both stood at attention. Next, I saw a young woman dressed in nurse's scrubs coming out of her apartment. And as she locked her door, she noticed the hearse and the cars moving by, and she stood still on her stoop, just long enough to honor the stranger's death and a family's grief passing her by. And then still there was another woman, older than the first, walking along the sidewalk. She crossed herself as we passed, and I could see her lips move as she said a prayer of some sort. Cars moved over to the side of the road. Pedestrians saluted. And I had never seen or felt anything quite like this before. And through this experience, I became connected to a man being honored for a life well lived, and to his family who loved him and very much mourned his passing. And I realized that even though I was only the 5th person on my colleague's call list, I was the lucky one, the one blessed to be a part of something so incredibly beautiful. And ultimately, through this encounter with this community of respect and honor and deep, deep love, I was the one that was transformed. Now that, I think, is what our long gospel reading, this lengthy chapter from John, is all about: transformation. And before you hear the word transformation and picture the man who was miraculously healed by Jesus in your head, I want you to think outside of that box. Sure, the man born blind from birth, whose sight is restored, takes the spotlight. And it's easy for us, sitting here 2,000 years later, to identify either with him or Jesus' disciples. But this story and the others that we've heard during this Lenten season, the stories of the unnamed Samaritan woman at the well, which we heard last week, and the Pharisee named Nicodemus, who coming to talk to Jesus and ask him questions under the cover of night, which we heard 2 weeks ago, all of these stories reveal the possibility of smaller, less obvious daily transformations, like the one I experienced with this family at their grandfather's funeral. Through these stories, we learn that transformation doesn't have to be a flash of lightning. Doesn't have to be a dramatic healing of a man born blind at long last receiving his sight. In fact, in this story, it seems that the Pharisees are the ones who are subtly experiencing transformation as they linger in and out of Jesus' presence. Think about it. Think about Nicodemus. He was a Pharisee. And like I said, we heard his story approaching Jesus with questions and curiosity just a few weeks ago. And today I have to wonder, is Nicodemus still part of that Pharisee, the crowd of Pharisees that was questioning the man who had been healed? This group of Pharisees desperately wanted to know, how could this once blind man be healed? How could he now see? And maybe Nicodemus was in that crowd listening to the testimony from the blind man and his parents. And maybe Nicodemus started to see himself as a man born blind. After all, something that we don't know exactly, something definitely sparked Nicodemus's curiosity and his interest in Jesus. Because we know that Nicodemus approached Jesus asking questions about his faith. We know that Nicodemus followed Jesus to the cross. And we know that Nicodemus even anointed Jesus' body after his death on the cross. Scales never fell from Nicodemus' eyes. He was never raised from the dead like Lazarus. But just the same, Nicodemus, a Pharisee, was transformed, healed of his own blindness, perhaps, by unexpectedly witnessing the blind man's testimony. Which brings me to one more important lesson from our gospel lesson today. And in it, the blind man is cured. He receives his sight from Jesus' touch and some mud, and then from washing in the spring-fed pool of water. But it takes Jesus 2 whole verses to tell that story. But as you heard, this story is long, and that is not where the story ends. It takes 29 other verses for John to describe the response of the Pharisees, which I think gives witness to the Zen proverb, quote, after enlightenment, laundry. That's right. The man born blind is transformed, but that transformation is only the beginning. With it comes work to be done. And over again, as we heard in that long reading, the man born blind testifies, I am that man. I was blind, but now I see. And he testifies over and over again to the Pharisees. He testifies to the community. And then he testifies more to the Pharisees. The man who was born blind, who received his sight, becomes a bold and persistent witness to Jesus the Messiah. Just like that unnamed Samaritan woman at the well who testified to people throughout Samaria that we heard last week. Jesus is the one who brought all of this about, and Jesus is the one with the power to transform. But with that transformation, we are given responsibility. And today's gospel compels us to confront our own blindness. And yes, it's hard to think of ourselves as blind, let alone associate ourselves with the Pharisees, who time and time again, Jesus calls out for their blindness. But being honest, the way I stepped in to officiate that funeral for my colleague reveals that, in fact, I was a Pharisee. And I was blind. I thought that I was doing that family a big favor. Turns out the opposite was true. I had been blind to the opportunity and the possibility of my interaction with them, and I was converted, transformed by that experience. Healing and transformation at Jesus' hand is possible in each and every one of us, and through each and every one of us on a daily basis. And our transformation then demands action by calling each one of us to share the good news. Because who knows? Who knows who might be listening? Who knows who might be watching? Who knows who might hear us and say, I was blind, but now I see, and be transformed. Amen.